My name is Jonathan Dupont, and I'm a research fellow at Policy Exchange. First thing to say, if you're looking for a great discussion of farming and agriculture, you're in the right place, but the wrong time. Sorry, that's at 12:30 today, but do come back for that. Today, instead, we are talking about cities, and we've been very kindly sponsored by KPMG, who I think they've got a banner right there. So just to set some kind of background, over the next 30 years, the UN predicts, I think, that the world urban population is going to roughly double with about an extra 3 billion people. Cities, to steal a phrase, are kind of the powerhouse of the modern knowledge service-based economy. They bring together workers and businesses and ideas and create something greater than sum of its parts. Unfortunately, in the UK, as we all know, we haven't always done such a good job of supporting most of our cities, and we haven't always made the transition away from kind of an industrial manufacturing city so smoothly. Many of our cities have lower productivity than the national average, which is actually quite weird for an advanced economy, and they're not very big either. I think in 1950, Manchester and Birmingham were both among the top 30 cities in the world. They're now not in the top 100. I think I worked this out. If Birmingham matched the OECD average for a third city, it would be twice as big or something like that. So today we want to look at how we can do it a bit better. Should our cities get bigger? Should some of them get smaller? Should our cities be looking to work together, or should they be in kind of a fierce competition kind of style? What new powers should our metro mayors be asking for? What should be their priorities? And to answer that, we have luckily two newly elected mayors. So on my right, I have Andy Street from the West Midlands, and on my... Very good.
Oh, yeah, we've got the home team in this morning. Jolly good.
And make sure you copy that, because we've now also got Ben Houchen from the Chief Lab. And then to complete the panel, we have Naomi Clayton, who's a Policy and Research Manager for the Centre for Cities. Thank you. And finally, we have Chris Hearld, who's the Chairman of the KPMG Northern Region and Senior Partner of the Leeds office. On my right. So I'm going to ask each of the panel to speak for about 5 or so minutes, and then we're going to open up for questions. So Andy Street, do you want to kick it off?
With pleasure, yes, thank you very much. Now, what's all this about Birmingham being third city?
Do you think it's second, do you?
Oh, there's absolutely no question. If you measure the size of the population or the size of the economy, there is no debate. So just let's get that right before we go any further. Okay, all right. But actually, there's a serious point there. That us being obsessed about the relative position in the UK is just old-fashioned thinking. And what we've actually got to think about is how Manchester competes internationally with its strengths and how Birmingham competes internationally with its strengths. So that takes us straight to the way through this is, of course, as it says on your document, the industrial strategy. So I genuinely believe that for the first time, the government is now thinking about how it enables our cities to compete. So what the industrial strategy is all about is actually identifying the competitive advantages of our city regions. And by the way, this can't be something we like to think is a competitive advantage. Every document talks about the same thing when you look at the old RDA economic documents. This has to be where there is genuinely an advantage on an international scale. And the hard thing for us to accept in the West Midlands, but it would be exactly the same if you look at other areas, is if you look at genuine advantage on an international basis, we have only got one cluster of international excellence, and that, of course, is our advanced manufacturing cluster. But the important thing is to acknowledge how you genuinely compete. What you can also do, and this, of course, is what we're doing in the West Midlands, is thinking about where the new advantages are going to come and where there are niches within overall sectors where we can compete. So I'll give you a few examples of that. If you look at life sciences, we have an increasingly strong cluster around medical research, actually doing drug trials on the most diverse population in the UK, which represents the world. So interesting. A cluster can be based on quite an unusual advantage that we found. And if you think of new niches, high-speed rail. What we've worked very hard to do in the West Midlands is make sure we don't just become the end of the London-Birmingham high-speed 2 line, but we actually concentrate all of the research that will go around HS2, so the signalling, the ticketing, the training, the head office, the civils, all in one place. So what we've actually done is we built a new competitive industry in that way. Now, Next, I want to put in a pretty blunt comment about government policy around this thinking about competitive advantage. Historically, regional policy in the UK, and I genuinely believe it's what's led to an underperformance of our cities, said we're going to distribute around the country all the spoils. And in the 1970s and 80s, there was actually talk of the West Midlands economy overheating, so the government actively moved, as it was then, car production away from the West Midlands. It was a distributed policy. It actually has been very damaging. And what the government has got to do in the new areas is concentrate support in the winning places. So give you a real live example of this. Electric car production and autonomous vehicle production has got to be based in Coventry. It has lots of the advantages already. If the government chooses to subsidise 4 or 5 areas around the country through the current challenge funds, we will end up with nowhere being strong enough to compete with Detroit and Stuttgart. So there has to be a concentration approach from government rather than a distributed approach. Next thing I just want to be clear about is the twin of the industrial strategy is, of course, the skills challenge. And in the West Midlands, we have a serious underperformance in our skills ability. Not at higher education, we've got some brilliant universities, but in the technical education, we are not providing the technical skills required for those new industries. So genuinely, I think one of the things the Mayor can do without the formal power to run technical education, we don't have that, not yet been secured through the devolution deal, but the Mayor has the ability to convene people together, to put a laser-like focus on underperformance and across the region bring a plan together to improve technical education. And again, there are links into government policy. We heard a lot yesterday from Greg Clark about institutes of technology. We heard from Justine Greening about her commitment to the skills revolution on Sunday afternoon. So I think that is an absolutely key part of the Mayor's role. And then the last two pieces of the Mayor's role are the infrastructure pieces that enable a region to compete. And the two keys to that are, of course, transport and housing. Now, if you think of transport, modern industrial cities around the world that are not in the situation of Birmingham's productivity are much better connected than we are. And if you think they do it on a regional basis, they don't do it on an individual local authority basis. So for the first time in the West Midlands, we have won about £4 billion of investment for transport infrastructure projects by working as a region, not by working as an individual local authority. And it is a huge opportunity that devolution has supplied us. And similarly, housing. If you think of the skills piece, the twin of the skills piece is, of course, the quality of accommodation that you can offer, particularly to aspiring graduates. Now, one of the brilliant stats for the West Midlands now is that we're attracting graduates to move from London into the West Midlands, one, because of our economic opportunities, and two, because of the quality of life issues. And more young Londoners have moved to Birmingham than any other city. But what we have to do is keep up with the housing demand that is now being driven by that. The stat for the West Midlands is we need 165,000 new homes over the next 15 years. It is an enormous number. And again, previous approach, individual local authorities have been locked in what I would call a fatal embrace, seeing who would blink first in terms of the supply of land and then, of course, actually the use of public money to develop out that land. What the combined authority enables us to do is bring about a plan of cooperation across the total area and actually has already unlocked new cash to develop previously unviable sites. So put those two enablers together, transport, housing, a vibrant economy based on the key sectors and a skills policy that addresses the technical requirements. I genuinely believe, as the numbers are proving now, that the West Midlands can have the fastest growing economy and critically can begin to close that productivity gap and compete for Britain as a whole on an international stage. So that's the plan and the approach.
Thank you very much. Good luck. Okay, I thought we'd turn to Naomi next. What advice do you have to Andy and Ben to really catalyse their cities?
Great. So for those of you that don't know Centre for Cities, we're an independent research organisation or think tank that's dedicated to supporting economic growth in UK cities. And by UK cities, we tend to mean the 63 largest urban areas across the UK, but of course we work quite closely with the combined authorities and the metro mayors. And I would absolutely echo what Andy said about the industrial strategy, recognising the importance of place and the need to put cities and city regions at the heart of the industrial strategy. The UK's low productivity is very much tied to the economic disparities that we see across the UK, and the fact that many of our cities and city regions really do punch below their weight. So I think it's worth just reflecting on a couple of figures there. Philip Hammond said that it takes 3 days for a German worker to produce what we produce in 5. Then if you look at those equivalent figures in the UK, in 2015, it took a worker in the southeast 3.5 days to produce what someone in the North and Midlands produced in 5. And the divergence of our regions is principally driven by the performance of our cities. So if our cities in the north were as productive as those in the greater southeast, our economy would be around £154 billion larger. But as it stands, only 6 of our cities sit above the European average when it comes to productivity. And all of those, with the exception of Aberdeen, are in the south. I think it's worth remembering why we care about productivity. It matters to wages and living standards, and it acts as a drag on future growth in both our cities and the UK economy. And driving up productivity in our cities means supporting highly productive, knowledge-intensive businesses. And that means supporting them to access ideas, skills, and markets. Because we know that there's a very strong relationship when it comes to productivity at the city level between employment in those private knowledge-intensive business services and productivity. So it's about creating the right types of environment for those businesses. And that might be about encouraging businesses to concentrate by improving our city centres. It might be about investing in infrastructure and the kind of broader suite of economic development initiatives that support businesses and create that environment. But I think what's fundamental in all of this, alongside finding the right mix of those policies, is investing in skills, particularly when we look at why many of our cities have such low productivity. So cities with the lowest levels of productivity also tend to have the lowest levels of skills. That's cities like Blackburn, Stoke, Swansea, but the same applies to our bigger cities as well. Many of our core cities punch below their weight in terms of economic output and productivity. If we look at cities like Birmingham, we can see that over 16% of residents have no formal qualifications. So skills is a big part of the answer. And we know, thankfully, that labour market policy, employment and skills has been a top priority for many of our local leaders and the mayors throughout the city deal process and the devolution process. And the mayors, amongst their kind of list of priorities, have got skills and employment right at the top in terms of apprenticeships, adult skills, work coaches. And the devolution deals mean that, mayors, the combined authorities, have more influence over the system at the local level. Of course, improving skills isn't just about investing in education and training. of course, it's fundamental, and arguably we need to invest more. But it's also about how you widen businesses' access to skilled workers through investment in housing and transport, and also investing in skills. This event's called Triumph of the Cities, to quote Ed Glazer, who wrote that book. It's also about investing in schools, because that drives up levels of educational attainment, but also attracts professionals that are looking for professionals with young families who are looking for good schools. So it's about the mix of policies, and the mayors absolutely need to be using their formal powers to design and deliver programmes that lead to better outcomes at the local level. And what's fundamental here is looking at what works. And I would say this because Centre for Cities is a partner for the What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth. But it's looking at the evidence base and seeing what do we know in terms of what works. And we know, for instance, that when it comes to skills, that in-firm or on-the-job programmes tend to lead to better outcomes than class-based training, for example. So we need to look at what works. We need to monitor the progress of different programmes and build the evidence base as the Metro mayors and combined authorities roll out their programmes. And I think, as Andy has mentioned, what's fundamental, alongside using their formal powers, is mayors using their soft powers to convene organisations and businesses. And this is probably one of the most important roles that mayors can play. Devolution in many ways has provided the incentive for businesses to get around the table with local authority leaders, the combined authorities and mayors, and think about what some of the solutions might be. So that's looking at ways to invest in education and skills in a way that responds to the needs of local businesses and local communities, but also about raising demand for skills in these places too. So the last thing I'll say is coming back to the first point I made, is there's clearly a role for mayors and the combined authorities in improving the performance of our cities, and they have a fundamental role to play. And cities must be placed at the heart of the industrial strategy going forward.
Thank you very much. Okay, Ben.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take a slightly different tact and look at this a bit more strategically. I think there'll be many learned people in here who understand exactly what a Metro Mayor does, but it's surprising still how few people know exactly what a Metro Mayor is there to do and what they're for. And again, I was on a panel event yesterday, and I was very clear, and I'd be interested to hear Andy's views on this, that I'm very, in the Tees Valley specifically, the job that I'm currently doing will be very different in 5 years' time and unrecognisable in 10 years' time. So devolution is a journey. Devolution is something which helps us deliver a specific outcome, and it's a starting point. It's an evolution of the old organisations and LEPs that really kind of came forward to make something happen. So to give a very specific example of the Tees Valley, I've taken the view that I'm there to drive economic growth. I have some powers. I don't have as many powers as Manchester. I have more powers than others, and same as or similar to other devolution deals. But I don't have a comprehensive package where I can pull a lever and solve something. So my position has been, with the powers that I do have around transport, economic incentives, the ability to set up mayoral development corporations, I am here to drive economic growth. Why am I there to do that? Because actually, if business is growing and succeeding, that can help with productivity, it can help with adding to the local GVA. But on top of that, it basically creates jobs. And if it creates jobs, that means more people have got more money in their pocket to look after themselves and their families, and that means I'm more likely to get re-elected, which is always a plus. But I think we've also got to be careful with devolution and what Metro Mayors can do, because devolution, while extremely important, and I think further devolution is the way to go, because it means more local people can take more local decisions, and it means that decisions by people in authority and exercising power are being exercised closer to the people who gave them that mandate. Devolution and the powers that we are seeking, and indeed I'm sure we'll come on to the new powers that we're all having discussions with central government about wanting, is not an end in and of itself. We've got to make sure that we are asking for powers to achieve the outcomes we want to achieve. And I was with the chief exec of Transport for the North yesterday, made a very, very good point that we need to also set ourselves objective outcomes. And one of the things we're looking at in the north, across the whole of the north, is the fact that average incomes are more than £5,000 below the national average. And actually, if we couch all of what we do, and if we frame all of our economic strategy in what I can do in the Tees Valley in the terms of what does this do to add value to the people of the Tees Valley and the businesses that can help with productivity and therefore wage growth, it then gives us a very focused position in which to grow from, because it's very easy to get lost, and I'm sure Andy's similar to I, that you, as that civic leader in a sub-region now, you get approached by everybody in every different sector, in every different walk of life, about every different subject. And if you tried to address every single one of them, you would never really achieve anything. So we have to be careful about that. And I also would say one of the benefits of devolution is that there is no universal answer. And this sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but we're going to talk about how mayors can solve cities, the problem with cities and problems within their regions. Actually, the answer to Andy will be very different to the answer to the Tees Valley, and Andy Burnham's answer will be very different to the both of ours, the same in the west of England and the same in Cambridge. So we've also got to be aware that what devolution also delivers is a bespoke package for each of us to be able to do what we need to do. And what that then leads on into is the industrial strategy. And I think the thread that we'll probably go through the whole of this session is what the importance that the industrial strategy plays. And to understand the industrial strategy, this is not some sort of top-down bureaucracy where the government say, you need to be doing this and you need to be doing that. Actually, it's a very collaborative approach. The government, in effect, have tasked me, and I'm sure they've tasked Andy and the other mayors, to come to the government and say, look, what are your sector action plans? Which sectors do you succeed in? Where's the data? Where's the evidence you're a UK lead or a world lead in this? Put that into a local industrial strategy, that will then be fed in, ideally, to a national industrial strategy. So Andy will be relieved that I will not be going forward wanting electric cars to be built in the Tees Valley. However, what I would say is that actually the Tees Valley accounts for 60% of the UK chemical industry. It produces 50% of the UK's hydrogen. We have one of the deepest ports in the UK. We have the abilities from our history in advanced manufacturing, logistics, biotechnics, healthcare. Some people may be surprised that our local university is a world lead in healthcare and actually exports their expertise across the world from the North America to the Far East. So we will be going with a very specific set of plans because I think, again, as Andy touched upon, you can try and spread yourself too thinly. But again, we've also got to realise that civil servants in Whitehall have a single job to do, and many of them mean well, but they don't get what goes on in the North East. They certainly don't get what goes on in my area. And so I would prefer to tell them what we're good at, evidence that, and then them say, fine, we have the trust in you to be able to deliver on that. And that then really then informs what is the second round of devolution deals to strengthen our local industrial strategy to be able to achieve on that. And the last thing just to touch upon that we both speakers so far have touched upon is I think people don't realise, and I certainly haven't quite got to grips with yet, just the strength of the soft power that Metro mayors have. In my election, one of the pledges that I made, one of the two pledges that I made that I know got me elected, was a review of the local police force. Now, we have a police commissioner. I have no formal or informal responsibility for the force whatsoever. But what people saw was a sub-regional leader standing up and saying, this isn't right, something needs to be done. And actually, we are starting, touch wood, to get some traction on that. And we find it around housing. We have some influence in housing. I don't have a formal housing deal. But again, we've already moved that forward in that we've just agreed a joint piece of research with the HCA and DCLG to look at a new settlement, a new garden town of 15,000 homes within the Tees Valley. Again, something that we recognise as an economic imperative. And I don't need the government to tell me on a piece of paper what powers I do and don't have. Actually, the really fun thing about being a Metro mayor at this moment in time, given that they're brand new, is it's what's not written down on a piece of paper. Because if somebody say if it's not written down on a piece of paper, don't do this. Well, that means I could do that. And actually, there's an awful lot that's not written down. And it's about expanding into that space and taking responsibility as that civic leader without spreading yourself too thinly and saying, look, what can I do away from my specific devolution deal that really adds value to the people, really drives economic growth, really helps economic regeneration and puts more money in people's pocket. So there's a much more strategic discussion to have about Metro mayors. The big discussion I think we're all having at the minute is what the second round of devolution deals look like. From my personal point of view, I actually think the second round of devolution deals, certainly within the Tees Valley, but I suspect elsewhere, will be less exciting, but much more important potentially than the first deal. And what I kind of couch it as, again, is rather than devolution deal 2.0 more of a devolution deal 1.5 to strengthen the areas that we have already existing powers in, a few extra powers to bolster that, and then probably not as many, but a few new sets of powers and money in devolved pots as well. And I suppose we finally got to couch, we've also got to put it in the context that ultimately, while devolution is a fantastic tool to deliver these aims that we want to achieve, we will always have to continue to work with government. And at the minute, I'm finding that the government are extremely bought into the devolution agenda. Specifically, I know that Philip Hammond yesterday and Theresa May in recent weeks, who was kind enough to come and visit me in the Tees Valley, are very much bought into the Northern Powerhouse agenda. And we need to make sure that we work hand in hand with government, because while we can have more powers and more money, there will be things that are of such significant strategic importance. For example, transport across the north, whether that be Northern Power Rail or something else, there will be things we'll have to work collaboratively on with central government. But we need to be that voice to central government to say what we need in our areas, in our regions, to be able to deliver that productivity and growth for the people we represent.
Thank you. Okay, Chris, what do you think Anglia Med should be focusing on to deliver growth?
Yeah, so I guess I'll bring a different perspective to this as a business leader looking in on this structure somewhat from the outside. KPMG across the north, we've got about 1,600 people, 50 partners across the big cities that you would expect us to be based in, and it's interesting to me that all the three speakers so far have referenced the soft power that elected mayors wield, and I think in business that's a very familiar concept. The idea that if you appoint a leader, you give a focal point, that is going to create opportunity. And I'll come back to talk about how I think that can work to the benefit of the individual regions, but also the UK as a whole, which is a really important part of this, I think. One of the issues that I'm passionate about is I believe that business is going to drive economic growth, and therefore the question for me becomes, how does devolution and the office of an elected mayor help create an environment in which business can flourish? The first point there, I think, is around accessibility and focal point. So what the guys in these roles can do, I think, is provide an access point for what, particularly for smaller and medium-sized businesses, is a pretty complex world to try and navigate when you are trying to engage with public sector bodies, councils, education authorities and others. And I think that's a really important role they can bring to the table. Secondly, at KPMG, we have a view that the future of our public services is going to involve a lot more collaboration across those public services, and looking at how business models in what are some quite challenged services are going to evolve over time. And I think the mayors can have a really important role in understanding, for example, what's the interaction between housing and health. How do you bring together your skills agenda to make sure that you address some of your long-term productivity challenges? So focal point, I think, is one thing. Secondly, collaboration. So looking after the northern region, I've obviously got on my patch, shall we say, a mixed bag of progress on devolution, I think is a fair way of putting it. And I think the opportunity that the mayoral structure creates is to drive a level of collaboration initially at a regional level. We've seen that happen really well in Manchester. We've seen that be more difficult over in Yorkshire. But then ultimately, as Ben's just referenced, I think a degree of collaboration across the north, which is going to be necessary if we're going to make the more fundamental changes to things like transport, which are really going to move the dial on productivity. So I think an important role there for the guys to play. And then the third point I'd make is around the need for this to be an additive thing for the UK economy. So what would be a disaster, I think, would be if devolution and elected mayors resulted in a kind of feud across the border where Birmingham is trying to outdo Manchester, he's trying to outdo Leeds, he's trying to outdo the Tees Valley. That doesn't really add anything to anybody. And so the challenge for all the individuals in those roles, I think, is to give their remit, turn their remit into an external one. Take their region onto the international stage. That's going to be really important, particularly in the next couple of years. One of the most interesting emails I've received, I get quite a lot, but over the last couple of weeks has been from KPMG in Sao Paulo, who'd written to me to ask me whether I could explain the Northern Powerhouse to them, and in particular how the food industry in the Northern Powerhouse worked. Now, it's quite an obscure request, but I think we should take it as a positive sign that branding, which government and others have put a huge amount of effort behind, is in my experience starting to generate some cut through internationally.
Did you reply?
It's work in progress. And I think the opportunity that we've got there is to go. I liken this to the way that KPMG runs itself. Why have we hooked up our Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool offices and created a northern region? The answer is because we can either be 2 or 3 medium-sized offices within the greater firm, or we can be one extremely influential region. And I think that same logic applies more broadly to the way in which the UK economy works.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think since we've got some people, we'll go straight to questions. Standard house rules. You can say your name, organisation, and keep it fairly short and actually question. That'll be great. Do I see any hands? Lady at the front there.
Hi, Sarah Masabi. I'm here from the Chartered Institute for Personal Development.
Mike's just coming.
Oh, thanks. Hi, I'll say that again. So I'm Sarah Masabi. I'm here from the CIPD, we're the professional membership body for HR. Andy Haldane, the Chief Economist of the Bank of England, identified the quality of management in our businesses as absolutely key to the productivity challenge. I'd just like to hear from the new mayors how they're planning to support small businesses in their regions to develop the kind of management leadership skills we need to improve productivity.
Yeah, it's a good question. How do we improve management?
Okay, so we haven't actually got this off the ground yet, but I am sufficiently confident to say that we're going to. So we are hoping to run what we call a mini MBA for small and medium-sized businesses with the university sector in the West Midlands, specifically around that. But, I actually think the productivity piece can be sort of somewhat limited in its discussion if you talk about just improving the performance of existing businesses. What I'm particularly interested in the productivity piece in the West Midlands is how we make sure that we're getting into the new sectors, because that's actually where you raise productivity and particularly think about the international standards, and particularly thinking about the digital and the tech, both sectors on their own and the way digital is transforming existing businesses. So yes, I saw Andy Haldane's report and I thought, yeah, we've got something to do around that. But actually, it is always a moving game. And what I want us to do is get ahead of the curve of where new high-value opportunities are coming.
Ben, would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that. I think one of the things we're looking at locally, or one of the things I think is actually across the piece on skills, is that we've seen a dramatic fall in workplace upskilling, which you cannot have a discussion with business without at some point them talking about skills, and we can't find this and we can't find that. And we tell them about some of the fantastic things that we're doing, we're going to plan to do, and we're going to change the world. But then you always say, well, what are you doing about it? And it's amazing how few businesses are doing anything about their existing workforce, which surprises me, because when I ran my own business, it was a mixture of needing highly skilled staff, but also machinery. And in a business, you don't think twice about spending £100,000, £500,000 on a piece of machinery. But for whatever reason, in recent times, people are less reluctant to invest in their staff. And one of the things I found from running my own business is that finding a good member of staff and keeping hold of them is like gold dust. And actually, we need to do more about that. When you're talking about management itself, one of the things that we're floating at the minute is we've obviously got, I'll tell you the transition of how we got there. We have a big pot of money to be able to spend over the next 4 years. I think in total I've got about just under £500 million to spend in the next 4 years with all of the funds that we have. And we're looking at how we can really capitalise on that. So we've just done a deal with Teesside Pension Fund to release £200 million of that, to invest in not just infrastructure, but into business. And one of the things that, speaking to businesses within the Tees Valley, that they think would really help is a fund that is quite flexible, that allows businesses, maybe from £1 million up to £10 million, to support management buyouts around looking at a bit of some deadwood, or people who've come to the end of the line, or they don't really have the enthusiasm for that business anymore, but maybe a business partner does, and actually they're looking for support and assistance to be able to kind of take that business on to the next level. Because we get a lot of businesses in the Tees Valley that expand quite quickly and do quite well, and they get to that £2 to £10 million bracket and then kind of get stuck. And a lot of the evidence we find is around the management, whether they lose enthusiasm or something happens, but then because the funds aren't there to be able to, for that person, incentivised to move on. So we're looking at that specifically. But I think on the wider issue of, and we'll talk a bit more about skills in more detail, I'm sure some people will ask a question, but about management as well, is the challenge to business. And I'm very fortunate that my local enterprise partnership sits within the combined authority, and we have a very, very active chair, Paul Booth, who was, I think, European Chief Executive SABIC at one point. And they get that business needs to do a lot more. And again, it's this convening power of we need to work with business to get more involved in training, in workplace training, work experience for the younger generation, but also the reskilling of existing workforce. They need to partner with us to understand what our priority sectors are and where we can support, and we will additionally support certain sectors rather than others. But then the other side of it is also then pulling in educational establishments, whether it be schools, further education, private providers, or higher education. So this is it's a big mix, but there are solutions within that, and I think we're starting to address them from what we think is quite an innovative way from the public sector's point of view to be able to do something to help a business move on.
Great. Next question. Gentleman right at the back there.
Hello, I'm Mark Flessing. I'm Chief Executive of Pocket. We are one of London's fastest growing housing companies, and we're backed by the GLA and the HCA. And we've just announced a complicated financing deal between the HCA and the GLA, which has given me a number of insights that I wanted to share with you about public-private partnership in this country.
As long as it ends in a question, but yes.
And it will end in a question. So the insight is that the public sector has a real lack of corporate finance skills. They allow their lawyers to negotiate their deals for them too often. And there is a real lack of confidence within the leadership of the public sector to bring the kind of corporate finance skills that the average business person would expect. I'm very interested to hear Andy on that subject in particular. The other thing which I learned from it, and it's the second round of complex negotiations between the public and the private sector that I've been involved with, is that the public sector is very poor in this country at assessing risk and understanding risk. It's related to the first one. When we talk about training, we talk about skills and further education. What can we do to give the public sector the confidence and the skills that it needs to be a better partner in the negotiations with the private sector?
Great. Andy?
My answer to that in the West Midlands has not been to try to change the public sector, which actually I think you slightly downplay their ability. It's actually been to try to get great partnering between the public and the private sector. And if I look at some of our biggest property transactions, they've been through our enterprise zone model, and there's been no lack of risk taken in those enterprise zone model investments. We've actually invested in different schemes over £1 billion against public sector assets, but it's been the private sector companies that have actually done the deals to make that happen. So that's been our practical answer to it, and it's why we've now extended the enterprise zones in the West Midlands to a new one in Dudley, to a huge extension around the HS2 terminal in Birmingham, to try to absolutely, as your question implies, bring the best of the public and the private together. And I think my approach will continue to be to drive those two together, not to say, actually, there's something wrong with the public sector and how it approaches this. And if I look at, just to give you an example, in your own area, the proposals that we put in last Friday around the Housing Infrastructure Fund, again, the same principle applies, that it's actually, it's using the public sector's ability for infrastructure investments to then liberate private sector investments around housing developments. So that's our approach.
Ben, do you want to?
Yeah, just to 2 points, but one to expand on what Andy said. Again, similar thing in the Tees Valley around this new settlement concept. We're having to work and be a bit more, have a bit more outside of the box thinking when it comes to, well, how do we deliver this pledge to build 10 to 15,000 new homes with all the associated infrastructure? Well, actually, we can't do that ourselves because of the road infrastructure specifically is quite expensive to input, so we have to work with government, DCLG, and the HCA on that. But it's how we do it, and we've couched it in terms of it's not just an application to DFT for funding, and it's not just an application to the HCA or the DCLG for Housing Infrastructure Fund. It's actually about speaking across departments. And you often find that one of the things that you can do as part of the combined authority is sit across 4 or 5 different government departments and put then a single bid in that gets dealt with, whereas I think previously local authorities and the mindset that they have specifically is very much linear, whereas I think we are trying to be a bit more innovative in the way we approach it. And I would say specifically about the staff, there are some fantastic local authority and public sector staff. However, one of the things that I found in the combined authority is we set ourselves up very differently. So my managing director, Andrew Lewis, used to work in the Treasury for 15 years. So I would say he's invaluable to me because he understands the levers of power. And actually, a lot of the people he was the boss of 10, 15 years ago are now quite senior within the Treasury, which is helpful. But aside from that, my investment director was a senior commercial lawyer at Bond Dickinson, a big firm in the north, and they've now expanded to North America. My recently recruited finance director that I recruited was a finance director at Deloitte. So actually, it's about a mixture of public sector talent who understand the levers that the public sector have, and actually, with the best will in the world, I'm not going to be able to change the structures of the public sector. So we need to be able to work within that framework, but also bring fresh and private sector ideas by mixing that with the other officers that we do have and we've brought in.
Chris, do you want to come up with a
Yeah, what I would say on this one is that I wouldn't say it's absent. I think it's patchy. So I've seen some great and quite innovative things done by public sector bodies in this part of the world, particularly I think on the property side and the type of project that Ben's talking about there with pension funds. I think that's a really unexploited opportunity as well for regions right across the UK. There's huge amounts of leverage. You know, it's ironic that we see more inward investment into the north of England from Canadian pension funds than we do from UK ones, which is interesting. For me, the issue is a word that's been used 2 or 3 times before. It's about partnership. I think there are some great skills within the public sector. You need those, and as Ben says, those structures aren't about to change overnight. What I'd like to see more of through the mayor's roles and the way in which they exercise their powers is for them to bring business to the table, so that there's much more collaboration.
Okay.
Can I just make a point on that? I think it was a point somebody said in their opening remarks. The one thing I found that's been a revelation about combined authority mayors is that I can't remember the president that said it, but it's that same concept of the American president saying, if you want to ring Europe, who do you ring?
Yeah.
And it is that. So I found just because somebody is looking to locate, for example, manufacturing, they look to Europe and then they say, where in Europe do they want to be? And actually people are still saying, we want to go to the UK. And then they say, where in the UK? And they look at the eclectic mix of who they could contact, and they see these little islands. And I'm sure Andy's had it where they think, well, we'll ring that person because they can get things done. And we're finding, you know, people from North America to the Far East, multi-billion pounds worth of investment that we're working through now, purely because private business understand a bit like what was said earlier. We're starting to speak their language, and that they want a leader that they can deal with, who can pull things together and deliver a package or a deal for them to be able to invest. Whereas you go through central government, it's a minefield, department by department, civil servant by civil servant. You go to local authorities who just aren't geared up for it and don't have the expertise. I think at the minute we're in quite a sweet spot to be able to attract that investment to our areas, to be able to really capitalise on actually a lot of foreign direct investment that does want to still come to the UK, whether Brexit is a success or not.
Very good. Lady in the front.
Thank you. I'm Vicky Browning from Akivo, the Association of Chief Executives of Voluntary Organisations. We've heard a lot about the public sector, we've heard a lot about the private sector, but I think there's an opportunity here for a stool rather than a two-pronged approach. And the third leg of that stool is civil society. Civil society acts often where the public sector can't or the private sector won't. The things we've talked about, skills, helping people into work, housing, health, a vibrant civil society is going to be absolutely crucial to the success of your devolved areas. So I'd be really interested to know how, as Metro Mayors, you're going to be working with civil society to sort of tap into and support that really important third leg of the stool.
Yeah, with pleasure. Do you mind if I slightly broaden the question as well? And I will come back absolutely to what you've said. But I don't mean to disagree with Ben, but I do want to just stretch something out a little bit from what he said. And it may be a slight difference between our two areas. I don't think it is enough simply to drive the economy in our areas. The truth in the West Midlands is that our economy underperformed for years, and it is now performing pretty well. And if you look at current stats, it's probably the best in the country. But the critical issue we have in the West Midlands is an imbalance between those who are really thriving. You look at Solihull, you look at Sutton Coldfield. Solihull is an economy that could easily be in the Thames Valley. It's an outstanding place. Grew by about 7% its economy last year. But 10 miles away, we've got areas where there is endemic worklessness. So there is a real issue about sharing the success that we're achieving. And I actually think people look to me as that focal point to have an opinion on that just as much
as having an opinion on growing the total economy. And actually, this is where the civil society piece is hugely relevant. So what we have already done is turn to a number of leaders of the voluntary sector to actually take on assignments on behalf of the mayor. And I suspect that is a model we will use more and more. So, for example, in the homelessness issue, which is absolutely acute in the West Midlands, and again, if you asked on the doorstep what's probably the single biggest issue, people would say, it's happened time and time again in the campaign, it can't be right in a region that's getting its act together that this is absolutely endemic. And so we have turned to the voluntary sector to lead our coordination work there, not on its own, but play absolutely leading work with the statutory sector. And what's fascinating is the response that all sectors have given to the leadership from the voluntary sector. And that is a model we will use time and time again.
Dan, do you want to come back?
I'll pick up on Andy's point first. I do think our areas differ slightly. A specific point, the reason I say that is that many of you in this room will not know that while the North East currently has the highest level of unemployment in the country, although it is dropping, and it does switch that place with London every now and again, we are at technical full employment. There are more jobs available than there are people looking for work in the North East. So one of the reasons that we came to this decision to look at everything in economic terms is that, well, if you're not utilising the workforce that you have locally and you're leaving people behind, and then there are additional supports that you've got to give to those people, but the jobs are there, what is that as a problem? And actually, while everything should be looked at in economic terms, ultimately, if you're growing the economy and you're giving people the best opportunity in life, then that should help raise people. And I appreciate that's an overly simplistic view. It's a bit more complicated, and actually there are some strings that come with how you support people that face barriers to work, which when we look at the voluntary sector, this isn't specific to me, but the government devolved some significant funds to all of the combined authorities, of which the North East received the most, probably for obvious reasons, around what was, I think, originally the hardest to help, or the Troubled Families Fund. So we got £6 million from the government. We put in an extra £1.5 million. So we've got £7.5 million to work with how we get people who face barriers back into employment. But I'm not there going to reinvent the wheel. It's like with a lot of things that I do, we don't necessarily do them directly because we're not experts in it, and we wouldn't want to do it because then we're assuming responsibility we really shouldn't have any involvement in. We're actually inviting anybody, whether it's the voluntary sector, the private sector, or even the public sector, to say, actually, we have an existing programme. If we had a bit more money, we could help so many more people, or we'd be able to expand this limited resource that we know is effective. So it's about drawing on people that are already doing fantastic things and good practice and being able to ramp that up. Specifically on the voluntary sector, though, one of the first things I did, actually within the first week of being elected, I made sure that we had some boards. We have lots of committees and boards within the combined authority, as you'd expect with a public organisation. And I made sure that we have 2 representatives on every single board from the voluntary sector, which is usually relevant to the board that they're actually sat on, because the voluntary sector does have a voice, as does the public sector and the private sector, and it should be heard. But as with everybody else, it should be balanced with other people's interests.
Naomi, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, and I think civil society and the third sector has a vital role to play, particularly in delivering a more inclusive economy as well. And I think many in local government are increasingly taking the view that, you know, local government isn't just a provider of core services, but an enabler too. And I think going forward, there are questions about whether, in working with the private sector and the third sector, whether local government needs to take a more structured approach to that and borrow some of the models that we've seen in the US and the approach that they take to collective impact, for instance, and also questions around how local authorities, combined authorities, might maintain some of the savings that accrue quite often to national government through some of the reforms that they make to public services as well, to help enable that work further.
Okay, so I think we've only got 10 minutes left, so I might take a group of questions at once. Do I see any hands? We've only got one. Lady back there. Thanks, Eve.
Hi, I'm Kate Langston from the Yorkshire Post. No doubt members of the panel may or may not be aware of the issues that we've had in Yorkshire around the kind of prospective devolution deals there and the South Yorkshire kind of deal seems to have somewhat collapsed, and there are authorities coming together now to push for a much broader One Yorkshire deal. And I just wondered, kind of given what we've been talking about today about unlocking economic potential, and just given the experience as well that the two mayors have had in their roles now, whether something on that scale would be both practical and kind of make economic sense.
I'll happily answer your question, which, and you might think it's a dodge of it, but is what I think. It's not for me to tell Yorkshire what to do. Every area must find the right answer for itself. And devolution, the whole point is that each place will go at its own speed and will do what is right for it, and there must not be one solution, just as there isn't the same economic plan for every area. So you must decide. But the provocative bit I'd put in is the voice that must be heard is the business voice. The real critical point in the West Midlands was that businesses, through some of our big employers, so the CEO of Jaguar Land Rover made it abundantly clear that he expected this to come together. He has plants in 4 of our local authorities. It would be a nonsense to try to deal with each one on its own. And also the business representative organisations, and critically the LEPs, played a brilliant role in sort of being the marriage brokers. And business wanted it to happen in the West Midlands because it gave, they knew it would give a regional economic plan. My suspicion is business in Yorkshire would want the same. So I would ask them to speak up and not allow this just to be a conversation for local government officers and, dare I say it, members of Parliament.
It's interesting, as I understand it, and I could be wrong, that the Sheffield deal is scheduled to go ahead. The legislation's been passed, and we may be in a position that Sheffield's not been able to get its act together, where it may elect a mayor that doesn't actually have a devolution deal, which I don't think would do any of us any favours, because I think it would show the Metro Mayor system not in its best light. But Andy makes the perfect point that everything around Metro Mayors has traditionally, or so far, been run by business. The only reason I'm sat here is we have a very strong LEP and business community over the last 10 years in the Tees Valley that finally got its act together and decided we've had enough of losing out to Newcastle and to the RDAs. We need a LEP. We needed Tees Valley Limited, which was then subsumed by the LEP. And they spoke with one voice. So when they went to government, the government heard one voice from the Tees Valley instead of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7. The problem we have elsewhere in the country, as I see it, is that business is often aligned because they've seen the success, or the initial success, that we're having in our areas with the devolution deals, but it's politics that gets in the way. And the two areas are Yorkshire. Yorkshire can't decide what it wants to do. And like I said, I agree with Andy, it's not for me to say, but unfortunately politics is getting in the way, and whether a greater Yorkshire deal is on the table or not, there needs to be a deal, otherwise Yorkshire and parts of Yorkshire will be left behind. And I think people are finding that is the case already with Tees Valley to the north. People are looking and saying we are losing out to the Tees Valley. And I know this is less relevant to you, but it needs to be touched upon. The perfect example of politics getting in the way is the Newcastle deal. The North of the Tyne deal is an absolute disgrace in that you've got business crying out, saying we're losing out, we want to do this, and they're all saying the same thing. But you've got politicians fighting, which means that the people of Newcastle and the wider area are missing out, and it's absolutely tragic, and somebody needs to get the bloody finger out and say, actually, this is what we want to achieve. I imagine there is some element of that in Yorkshire, whether it be through local authorities, MPs, or whoever you like. But you also have to find as well that there has to be a will politically, because I can sit here and say, you know what, I'm actually sat here because 5 Labour local authorities leaders sat down with who was then a local Tory MP, who was the Northern Powerhouse Minister, and they did what was best for their area because they knew that this was the only game in town. And unfortunately, until you get that political meeting of minds where you can put that to one side and say, actually, this is just the best thing for the area, North of the Tyne and Yorkshire, I think, will struggle to get the deals that we've managed to get, because we've managed to get our ducks in a row and sing to government from the same hymn sheet that we've got to continue with as well, because we've been told very clearly by civil servants that, you know, they continue to engage with us and they want us to succeed. But if it all breaks down and we start fighting, and the cabinet and business and I as mayor all start saying different things, it then becomes difficult for the government to be able to give further assistance. So it's about bashing heads together, and somebody needs to get around the table in Yorkshire and sort it out. It's the honest answer.
Chris, would you agree it's about bashing heads together?
Yeah, I don't know about bashing heads. I mean, look,
we should literally bang heads together.
Yeah, literally. I mean, there are quite a lot of people in Yorkshire who are good at that. What? You know, I've lived and breathed this to a certain degree over the last year or so. I think the point that's just been made about what business needs is exactly right. You know, I worry about this, and business leaders that I talk to worry about this, because sitting across a region where we've seen the progress that's been made in Manchester, I can see very clearly how Yorkshire is missing out, and where it could miss out if we don't get on the bus soon. The pragmatic business side of me says the most important thing is to get a deal on the table that can get done, and then you build from there. Of course, I'm not a politician, and I'm sure that there are all sorts of complexities attached to that very simple narrative that I don't understand. But you know, at the most basic level, I think it's really important that the region starts to move forward. And actually, I think all of those of you who are not of Yorkshire or from Yorkshire should be worried about it as well, because this is a huge economic region, and I think the north of England and the rest of the country is missing out by it not fulfilling its potential.
Just quickly on that point, sorry, I don't know the economic makeup. Well, obviously I'm from Yorkshire, so I do get it roughly, but from economic centres, the one thing that I found with the success of the devolution deals at the minute is it makes sense to get an economic area that fits together both from an economic perspective and a community perspective. I think that people need to decide, when you talk about the Greater Manchester deal, and this is more of a technical point, you know, is a one Yorkshire deal the right thing to do? Do the people in Sheffield have enough in common with the people of Richmond and North Allerton? You know, do they have the same in common with the people of York and Harrogate? And it may be that, and this is the difficulty, I think, from a technical perspective of county deals, which is probably why not many of them really happened, was that counties are large things in themselves, and as soon as you start to spread out, then economically and from a community perspective, it then becomes very difficult to hold them together. And I think the one thing that I've seen from certainly my deal, Andy's deal, and the Manchester deal is it doesn't matter whether you're from Darlington or Redcar, or whether you're from, you know, the centre of Manchester or Trafford, you feel like you belong to that community and that economic model. And while everybody from Yorkshire, including myself, tells everybody that they're from Yorkshire, you don't necessarily, if you're from York, have the same affinity to people in Sheffield or Bradford as you might otherwise. And that's the difficulty, I think, with the Yorkshire deal, of trying to get everybody singing from the same hymn sheet with the same vision, because I think there are different visions potentially in Yorkshire.
I think that's a very valid point, and it needs working through. That I've seen various iterations of it with tiered models and different ways in which different powers would be devolved to bits of it. I go back to what I said earlier. I think it's incumbent on those who are in a position to do so to get a deal on the table that everybody can sign up to and build from there. That's the way you would do it in a business context, I think, and I don't see why you wouldn't do the same thing in this particular instance.
Andy, would you have any advice for areas that don't have that same sort of natural city centre to look to, or county deals?
I'm quite clear on this. I wouldn't be forcing deals on places that aren't a natural economic areas. The whole logic of the West Midlands deal, and we had a lot of unlearning to do, because historically areas of the West Midlands had been proudly independent, but we actually needed to prove that there was an economic logic to it. We call it the travel to work area. It proves it all absolutely categorically, and then when everybody saw that, fine. The other piece of advice I'd have is that it's got to be additive. There's no prizes if I'm trying to do what Dudley Council does better itself, frankly. And you've got to be able to reassure the players around that. But don't force it if there isn't the political will and the business will, because it won't work.
I think that's a good note to end on. So if you want to know more about industrial strategy, we've got this great document at the back. I would say that because I helped write it. We've also got another paper coming out on local industrial strategy in a few weeks, so look out for that. Which leads me to thank you very much for coming. Thank you to KPMG for sponsoring it, and thank you to our panel.